So when I got the opportunity to edit the letters, I couldn't turn it down, and but I knew that there would be a big job of work ahead. John, of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the range of his work: six published novels, 4 collections of short stories, a play, essays, and but yet at the same time, it's containable. You know, you can get through the McGahern canon, as it were, in with careful reading over a couple of months, I would say. Um, and but I was very keen to add to that canon with the addition of letters. So where are the letters? Well, this is one of the problems. They're all over the place. Madeline was able to give me a head start. She had a number of letters in her possession, which I quickly got copies of and began to work on. And but then they're in many archives all over the world. So these 6 photographs here, I'll just go from top left across. Top left, the Harry Ransom Center in the University of Texas at Austin, which holds the papers of Knopf, John's American publisher for The Dark, and then much later, That They May Face the Rising Sun and Memoir. They also have some correspondence with the London Magazine, a magazine John published several of his stories in, including, say, My Love, My Umbrella in 1970. The top middle is the Library of the University of Maryland, which holds John's correspondence with a woman called Fran McCulloch, who was his American editor for The Pornographer at Harper and Row. Top right, the New York Public Library, which holds John's correspondence with his American agent, Tim Seldes, from the late 1970s onwards, and also has his correspondence with his favorite New Yorker editor, a woman called Frances Kiernan, with whom he published stories like Sierra Leone and Gold Watch and Eddie Mack in the late 70s and early 80s. Bottom left is Galway, which has, of course, the largest McGahern collection anywhere in the world. I was lucky enough to work in the archive in Galway for about a year between the academic year 2012 to 13, when I was writing the book that became Touchstones. And it's a huge archive of mainly drafts of novels and short stories, but also some letters. So for instance, his letters to Patrick Gregory, his editor at Knopf for The Dark, are there. His editors to Neil Walsh, his doctor friend at Ballinasloe, which are very interesting, are there. Then bottom middle is University of Indiana, which I'll return to in a minute. And bottom right there is Faber and Faber in London, which is right beside the British Museum in London. I think it's going to move soon, actually. But they keep very good papers there. And, they were tremendously useful. The longest run of letters I have to anyone in the book are to Charles Monteith, his editor at Faber, between 1961 and when Monteith retired in the 1980s. Then, of course, there are letters in private hands. Some of you here tonight perhaps have a letter or two from John McGahern that I didn't manage to find, and that's inevitable. I mean, I knew all editors have to accept that completeness is probably impossible. But I felt that I got letters from essentially every month for every year, from the first adult one in 1958 to final emails he was dictating to Madeline in 2006, shortly before he died.
Can I talk? Sorry, just if...
That's fine now, Mark. That's fine. That's fine now, Tom. There's no noise now. I'll carry on. Sorry. Let's get back to one of the places that the letters are kept, which is, take this letter. This is a letter that John wrote to Patrick Swift in 1960, which can be found in Indiana. And Paddy Swift was the editor of a magazine in London called X, a quarterly review, which ran to 7 issues from 1959 to 61. John had become friendly with Paddy's brother Tony after meeting him in a dance hall on O'Connell Street in the mid-1950s. And then he had become friendly with the whole family, including a man called James or Jimmy Swift. And it's to James Swift, you'll know, that John dedicates The Barracks, his first novel. James or Jimmy encouraged John to send some work to Paddy in London. And he did. He sent him an extract of a novel he was working on called The End or the Beginning of Love, which he never published and which you can find in the Galway collection today. When it was published, the very influential Faber editor, Charles Monteith, read it and was very impressed by it and wrote to John. And John writes back, I'll come to this in a moment, delighted, of course, that this very notable character should like his work, and the most important literary relationship of John's life begins. As you can see in this early letter, it's the handwriting is quite neat, cursive, easy to read, and his handwriting disimproves somewhat over the years, as we'll see in a moment. This is a later letter, much later, 1992, to Colm Tóibín. Colm Tóibín became friendly with John McGahern in the middle 1980s. He first met him in 1986 after the publication of High Ground, when he interviewed him in the Nuns Island Arts Centre in Galway. And they corresponded then for a number of years. Tóibín would often send John a new novel to comment on, and John would write back, and he'd rarely be enthusiastic. He might start soft, but he'd soon start criticizing the work. And this isn't just something that John did with Tóibín. He tended to do this with nearly everybody. He was a very demanding judge of literary excellence, and he had very set ideas of what great prose could and should look like. But you can see in this letter, the handwriting is more blocky. It's changed a lot from the early handwriting. It's more jagged. That said, it was rarely that I couldn't read a word. Almost everything was readable. And there's only a few times across the course of the letters that it stumps me and I have to just leave a question mark there. Back to Charles Monteith. Monteith, sorry for the quality of this photograph. It's not great. Monteith is the very tall man on the left wearing glasses. He was from Lisburn. He had gone to Inst, the boys' school in central Belfast, and then onward to Oxford, Magdalen College, Oxford, where he was a star student, eventually graduating with a double first in English and law. His studies were interrupted by the Second World War. He served in the British Army in Burma and rose to the rank of major, where he was injured and always walked with a limp. He's portrayed in That They May Face the Rising Sun as the character Robert Booth. The other people in the picture are the royal family of Sweden, and the man on the right is William Golding, who's receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature. William Golding, as you'll know, wrote a book. His first novel was called The Lord of the Flies. And William Golding had submitted that book to every major London publisher. It had been rejected by every major London publisher, including Faber. But Monteith had just recently started work at Faber. He was friendly with Geoffrey Faber from his Oxford days and from being a fellow of All Souls College. He found this novel in the reject tray, and he started to read it, and he thought there was something in it, and he started to work with William Golding, and it used to be more of a science fiction book, and it becomes something more like a realist horror. I'm sure some of you have read it. Anyway, it succeeds, and it goes on to sell over 20 million copies for Faber. So Monteith immediately was worth his weight in gold to the company, and Golding goes on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Other writers who Monteith worked very closely with and went on to extraordinary success include Philip Larkin, Seamus Heaney, Ted Hughes, Paul Muldoon, and others. He was a remarkable editor, a remarkable spotter of talent. And John McGahern is no exception. He reads this short extract in X in March 1961. He likes it. He writes to X and he says, "Can I see more work?" And this is John's first letter to Monteith. "Thank you for your letter of the 14th of March concerning the extracts that appeared in X. It is the first novel that was actually accepted for publication, but by then I could not in conscience publish it without serious revision. The pieces in X are part of the revision. In the revising, another novel evolved which owed nothing to the first. And that novel, of course, is The Barracks. I felt I must leave the revision aside for a time and finish and try to publish this new work. The publishers do not seem to like this delaying, and I am not happy with the position. I sent the first part of this new work to the editors of X, who have just written to say that they consider it a real advance and exciting. Whether this opening, 13,000 words or so, would be too slight for you to make me an offer or not, I do not know. If you consider it possible, I could let you see a copy. I hope this does not seem all confusion. I am not bound by any contract or agreement. Naturally, the idea of you publishing me is enormously attractive." Faber back then were a prestigious publisher, one of the most prestigious publishers. And McGahern was especially attracted to them because T.S. Eliot was on the board of directors, and John was a great fan of Eliot's, particularly four quartets. So this is the beginning of a very happy relationship. And John publishes The Barracks with Faber and goes on to publish all of the rest of his work on this side of the Atlantic with Faber. The Barracks, which I'm delighted I'm speaking to tonight in this sort of strange, disembodied digital world that we live in post-COVID. I'm sure John McGahern would find this hilarious that we were doing this, that we're speaking, that Tom's sitting in that very barracks now, where John lived many years as a boy after the death of his mother, and which forms the core of his first great novel, The Barracks, published in 1963. I've only ever been in that building once. It was still a Garda barracks at the time, and I very much hope I can visit the centre at some future point. I want to just move on to a few letters that I particularly like, or I think are particularly interesting. The first of them is to do with the dark and its banning in 1965. The letters, if you've read them, you'll know, I think they're very revealing of how that all came about. And one of the things I discovered whilst researching the letters was that John and Charles Monteith were both genuinely worried that the barracks might be banned because it uses the F word or some form of the F word repeatedly. And Monteith took legal advice from a Dublin solicitor. The Dublin solicitor told him not to publish it. John insisted that it would be published, and Monteith accepted that, and they went for it. And it wasn't banned. But I suspect that John was then a marked man, and that the censors were waiting in the high grass. And I further suspect that John then very deliberately threw the gauntlet down at the censors and opens the first page of The Dark with F-U-C-K. Anyway, we all know what happened then. It was banned. John was upset by the banning, but I think not at all surprised. He had made sure not to be in the country, not even to be in Britain when it was published. He was in the south of Spain when the book was published, very deliberately, because he knew there was going to be hell. This is a letter he writes to Patrick Gregory, his editor, his American editor at Knopf, in October, where he's telling him what has happened. "Dear Patrick, it's a long and mostly boring story. I'll try to shorten it. The 8th of May telegrammed to phone them." This is the school he worked in, Belgrove in Clontarf. "It was to tell me not to come. I didn't telephone and presented myself for work. They were very afraid, the teachers. The headmaster read me a note that I was suspended until the priest interviewed me. This would have to be after the 6th of November, end of his holidays. I then saw the union. They were willing to fight sacking on the grounds of dark, but not on a civil marriage. John, in November 1964, had married the Finnish theatre director and translator Annikki Laksi in a registry office in Helsinki. I do not think I could go through the farce of a ceremony, cage Anu here, bow my head, work humbly for them, and live with myself and work with myself. Anu doesn't want to go through with it either, and she doesn't want to live in Dublin, which I want. But it seems impossible. It seems it must be the woman's land of London. So I meet Anu in London tomorrow. We'll decide over the days what to do. I'll then go to see the priest after November the 6th and probably get sacked. Nothing now can affect my work. It grows only more clear, this journey into my changing self in search of style. But physically and financially, it cannot be as easy in London as it was, but that only lies down beside the first. So I think there are all sorts of interesting things going on in that letter. It's clear that John would very much have liked to have stayed in Dublin, but both because his wife didn't like it and because he is indeed correctly predicts that he's going to be fired from his job. He would have found it very difficult to get teaching work in Ireland after that. So he moves to London, lives with Annikki and his sisters for a period in Leytonstone, and then in a number of other addresses around the East End of London between about 1965 and 69. And he doesn't write very much in those years. Those are difficult years for him. He's a supply teacher in a tough school in Chingford in the East End. He finds it difficult to write. And those are difficult times for him. So I think in later years, when he was often quite dismissive of the banning, I think he was being somewhat disingenuous. I think the banning had a very severe effect on him, both
much of a I can't even hear it now.
both in terms of kind of inhibiting his own writing, but also just the practicalities of no longer having a salary from an Irish school. I want to move on to some family matters. Amongst the most interesting letters in the book, I think, and amongst the best John wrote, are to his youngest sister, Dimpna, in the late 50s and early 1960s. This is a family photograph. There's Sergeant Frank McGahern in the background, and John, of course, there on the right. Bottom left is Dimpna. So John had left home really in the early 50s. He'd gone off to briefly University College Galway and then St. Pat's in Drumcondra, after which he worked in Athboy, Drogheda and Dublin before being fired and moving to London. But he would write home, and he appears to have had this particularly interesting epistolary relationship with Dimpna. And this is one of his letters back to Dimpna. It's about work and, how to deal with work. And John always thought of writing as work. He always described it as work. He didn't have any kind of, I think, romantic ideas about the writer as a kind of inspired poet, or the writer as needing a muse. He saw it as work, and he always found writing difficult, and he worked very hard at writing. So this is to Dimpna. You should try to come to terms with the people about you and with your work. If you can't endure them, find devices to avoid them, or to see as little of them as possible, or to get clear of them altogether. If you dislike your work, set about getting another kind of work. To do any of these things, you'll have to discipline yourself and work. There is no such thing in life as freedom, only the freedom to choose, and that not always. And our choices impose their own tyrannies on us, but only a person who fails, who gives everything up as hopeless, can become wooden. And now he talks about an essay that some of you will have done for your leaving cert. I did for mine anyway, or maybe possibly my intercert, I can't remember, by Charles Lamb, The Superannuated Man, which is about retirement and office work. Lamb didn't let the wood get into his soul. How could one piece of wood say that an office makes people into other pieces of wood? Only a thinking person could recognize such a thing. I at least have no wish to be a lily of the field. I would not want to be a lesser thing than I am. I can, by discipline and honesty and work, be greater. To give up is to go in the direction of the lily or the piece of wood or the pig, to lose our consciousness or our souls. I was glad to know that you were reading. Read many books. Not until you have read many books, bad ones and good ones, will you know what you want. And always read what you enjoy. But now that you are young, read several and many books, because even now the time is slipping away from you that leaves a lasting impression on your life. Until you have read many books, do not have too many opinions about them, because it is only by comparison that books, no more than most things, are good and bad. And John, of course, himself was a voracious reader. First, thanks to the Moroni's library near Coot Hall there. But then in later years, he continued to read enormously, widely, and deeply. And that reading frequently comes through in our study of the letters. Moving on to another favorite letter of mine. This one is to Michael McClaverty, the Belfast novelist and short story writer and teacher, who John wrote a fan letter to in 1959. And this began a correspondence. These letters are in the Linen Hall Library in Belfast. This is a letter where John is writing to McClaverty about his winning of the AE Prize, which was the most prestigious literary prize in Ireland at the time. It was awarded to writers for a body of work under the age of 35. It had never been won before by a prose writer, always by a poet. Patrick Kavanagh, for instance, had won it. And at first, John admits to being excited, but then he says the excitement quickly clears. And I think you have classic John McGahern here. For a little while, the morning it came, I was excited as a schoolboy with the award. And then afterwards, there was the blank, inscrutable face of my work that knows nothing of awards or rewards, but only faith and passion and suffering, and the long availability which we call work will move. The most gladness my success, if so little can be called that, has brought, apart from my friend's sake, is to affirm in my bones that all success and failure are private. What happens outside that are either lucky or unlucky accidents, for all art approaches prayer. The question of John's religious sensibility is, I think, a very interesting one. I think of him as a religious writer, albeit one who, by the mid-1960s, had abandoned his formal Catholic faith. It's interesting to see behind Tom there the Sacred Heart. I think that John loved the ceremonies of the church. McClaverty was a devout Catholic, and I think that's a very interesting statement. All art approaches prayer. That on another occasion I might spend more time on, but I'd best move on with the letters. This is an angry letter. This is to another American editor, Peter Davison, at Atlantic. Atlantic published Nightlines in America in 1971. It was published by Faber in London in 1970. Terrific collection of short stories, John's first collection of short stories. This was the proposed cover that Davison sent John. And John writes this letter to Davison from Madrid in September 1970, and he's very angry about the proposed cover. My heart fell at the sight of the cover. Impression, a schoolgirl's book, a chocolate green or green chocolate of the pig in the kitchen. My prose stands against everything the cover says. Surely Yeats, Joyce, and Beckett gave Irish letters some universal dignity. I might let it pass if I thought it would find its readers. My experience is that people likely to buy a book are people who enjoy the language. A cover like that is the same as selling cheese under a sugar label. That hankering after the little old homestead is played out. Grove have no need of it. The cover is lazy, unimaginative, and it stereotypes, since whoever designed it thought it a cliche, a long dead one at that. Why can't it just get decent type and red and black if nothing can be better thought of? That cover is death to the book. Gregory wouldn't have let it through. I don't want to hear the viciousness in his laugh when he sees it. And you, as a poet, as well as a publisher, must be able to see it's a disaster. That kind of Irish cover has been literally played to death and is as dead as the literature it symbolized. Lovely mists that do be rising on the bog, top of the morning. I'll be back at 1 Rue Christine on the 1st of October. Can you write to me? Forgive any mistakes. I am disturbed. So you can see for yourself the thatched cottage, the old lady in the shawl, the cozy homestead. And if you've read Nightlines, and I'm sure you have, you'll know that Nightlines couldn't be further from this world. It could not be further. Nightlines is a harsh, sometimes disturbing, sometimes pitiless view of Ireland. So to present it as a kind of rerun of The Quiet Man meets Peg Sayers is a kind of travesty. And McGahern knew that. And McGahern, I'm pleased to say, got his way with this. And Atlantic did publish it in a much plainer cover with just the word Nightlines in several lines on the cover. But it's interesting that John should write this letter to Davison. I mean, John isn't an established writer really at this point. You know, this is his first collection of short stories, and Davison is one of the most powerful editors in the US. He's the poetry editor at the Atlantic Monthly magazine. He's the overall editor of the Atlantic Press. And I think it's interesting that John should have such a hands-on approach to how his books ought to be published at this point. This is a letter John wrote to a man called Joe Kennedy. It took me a long time to figure out who Joe Kennedy was. Looking back now, I should have been able to figure it out quicker. I should have been able to find him quicker. But anyway, it took me a while. And I got lucky eventually and I found him. It turns out that Joe Kennedy, who's still very much alive, I'm pleased to say, was the first editor of the Sunday World newspaper. He was a newspaper man who John first met in digs in Drogheda in 1955. This is much later. This is 44 years later that he writes this letter to Joe Kennedy. And what has happened is that Joe has written to John and about a book of letters between Frank O'Connor, the Irish short story writer, and William Maxwell, the editor of the New Yorker. And in one of those letters, Frank O'Connor says something very dismissive about McGahern. And Joe asks him to respond, and this is John's response. The literary stuff doesn't matter. Literary reputations last as long as the body of work they represent remains useful, whether to one reader or to many, and will disappear into the long night like ourselves eventually. What matters is the spirit to which they give utterance. Like many things that come my way, that I was once part of, the enclosure is both accurate and inaccurate. I attended that party in O'Connor's flat. I went reluctantly. Elizabeth Cullinan, Betty, needed an escort. I wasn't even her boyfriend. She was in the middle of a bad love affair. It was the one time I met Frank O'Connor and he remained in bed throughout my stay, which wasn't long. The prize was the A.E. Memorial. The Barracks wasn't published then. The Englishman was almost certainly Philip Edwards, Professor of English at Trinity. Thomas Kinsella was expected to win the A.E. I had no hope and only entered at Charles Monteith's insistence. Faber offered to pay the expenses if I lost. Typing 5 or 6 copies of an unfinished novel, having it typed, was expensive then, and it absorbed most of the £100 prize. The edge to O'Connor's remark was due, I imagine, to a TV interview I gave on winning the prize. I was asked, what do you think of O'Connor and of Whalon? It was like asking a young writer now, what do you think of Heaney and Friel? I replied blithely, I don't think about them at all, thinking with a young person's conceit that I had adroitly avoided the question. Elizabeth C. told me that O'Connor had watched the interview and that I couldn't have said a worse thing. So much for conceit. I also said Beckett and Kavanagh were the 2 living Irish writers I most admired. Kavanagh had attacked everybody, including O'Connor and O'Whalon. I read a long, sad attack by O'Connor on Beckett about the same time. My response was an unfair young person's response, and I would prefer it to have been different. I think O'Connor's early work, particularly his first book and the first parts of his autobiography, is good work. Too late, too little, and it probably wouldn't have done them either. I'm getting close to the end of my run here, so I will. Yeah, I think I have time to look at one more letter. This is a late letter. John, at this point, knows that he's terminally ill, and he's writing to his friend Michael Gorman, who has sent him a book of photographs of old Sligo. Michael's from Sligo, and he's thanking him for the book, and he's telling him about his illness. Thank you for your letter and the 2 tempting truffles and the Sligo photos. I love those old photos. They look at you out of a depth of time. But there was no dear Paddy Morahan. Paddy Morahan was a man he had gone to school with in Carrick back in the day. He would be with Sligo Rovers, and the old band seems to be in operation. There's not too much difference here, other than the adjustment to a different reality. A reality we always knew was there and unavoidable, but is still different when it comes. I used to have ways of avoiding going to the room to write, disliking the intensity and total absorption, but now I'm glad of it. It belongs more to now than when we felt free in acres of time, and that too was necessary and is. I find I have to be socially more careful. All society excludes this knowledge in order to function. There was a do for an old friend of mine, Alf Rowley, a barman in Mohill 2 years ago. He was dying, and the function was to help pay bills. He lived less than a week afterwards. He had a fine singing voice, and at the end, before the soldier song, he rose and thanked them, and then sang, I bid you all a fond goodbye. There wasn't a stampede for the door, but it was the next best thing, and mutterings about the poor man not being in his right mind, the Leitrim way of describing a lack of tact. And John, of course, one of the interesting things about John's final illness is that it prompted him to write his final book, which was Memoir, which was a book I don't think he ever really intended to do until, it was clear that he wasn't long for the world. That's my sense of it anyway. And the late letters where, he explains to a number of friends about his illness and the fact that he's not going to recover are, I think, very moving and very interesting. Just to conclude, the book is now over a year old. It got a great reception when it came out. It was reviewed everywhere you would want it to be reviewed, from the Irish Times to the New York Review of Books to the Wall Street Journal, the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, etc. For the most part, I was very pleased with those reviews. Although, it's in a very real sense, I didn't write this book. John McGahern wrote it. He certainly wrote 75% of it. I wrote the footnotes and the introduction, and that's it. So it's his book. And, I was pleased with the reception. I think, if nothing else, it showed that John McGahern still has a worldwide audience, and that he's taken very seriously as a writer, and he's taken very, very seriously by the most serious publications. And I was delighted to see that. And I would be optimistic that when the biography comes out in a few years' time, it will give John's memory a similar kind of boost and get people, I hope, back reading John McGahern, because that's the most important part of, if my work will have failed if that doesn't happen. People need McGahern and his work need to be kept alive, because he's one of the great writers, not just Irish writers, but the great world writers, in my view, of the 20th century. Some of you tonight must have known John McGahern. I'm now writing his biography, and I'd like you to get in touch with me if you've got anything to share. This is my email address, fshovlin@liverpool.ac.uk. It's also on the university website. I'm easy to find. I'd be very interested to hear anything you might remember about John McGahern, no matter how small you think it is. You may remember him and his family. You may remember him as a boy, as an older man. You may have just had some fleeting meeting with him. You never know what could, for me as the biographer, can be the most useful piece of information. So thanks very much for the invitation, and I hope the Barracks continues to prosper, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. And needless to say, very interesting, very professionally well put together, and very engaging. I just want to say that Frank may be correct to say that 75% of it was written by McGahern. This is the letters collection. For those who haven't read the book, if without the footnotes, the letters would be a lot of them would be unintelligible, and a lot of them would be it wouldn't be in context. What made for me the most remarkable, and in terms of literary footnotes, this is the best I've ever come across in terms of attention to detail. What Frank went out to discover in order to make a connection and to what was John referring to, and that the detailed detective work that he went to is quite remarkable. Okay, thank you. And I just want to, I'm waiting for chats to come in. And before doing that, there's two things. One, for me, when I read the letters, I learned again that so much of McGahern's writing was autobiographical. And in particular, I had no idea. I thought The Pornographer was the one autobiographical novel. But in fact, it's in the letters that the context and the deeply personal background to that novel becomes clear. Maybe you might comment on that, Frank.
Yes. Well, on the one hand, I think that John felt that often that if work was too close to the autobiographical, that the work would suffer, and that work it had to maintain some kind of distance. So I was talking to someone last week who knew John in the early 2000s, a writer, who told me that he would go walking with John in Dublin, and that John was dismissive of the early work, especially of the dark, which he felt was written in anger, and that to write in anger was a mistake. That you had to find distance and coldness in order to write well. That said, you're right. All of John's novels and stories have an autobiographical tinge to them, but it's not autobiography, and I think it's important to say that it's not. It is fiction, and this is going to be one of the difficult things for me as a biographer. Is be careful not to claim too much on the strength of a novel or of a short story. But there's no question. I think you can read the life alongside the work very closely. And like, as you said, it's the Pornographer is very close to events that happened in John's life. The leave taking is very close to events that happened in his life, and so on. That they may, right to the end, that they may face the rising. All of it. Yes, for sure. But with the caveat that none of these books are autobiography, except memoir, of course. And memoir is an unusual book in itself, in that it actually tells us very little about John McGahern, despite its title. It's really about his parents, I would say, more than it's about himself. Anyway.
And that's very okay. And I have so many questions, but I want to go because there's one question there that has come in that links to that. What do the letters reveal about his character that we didn't know from before?
Well, I suppose that depends how well you knew John McGahern before you read the letters. I mean, I think he was exacting, serious, funny. I think that he was religious. Not necessarily in an orthodox fashion, but I think he had a religious sensibility. I suppose what they reveal most of all is that he was extremely serious about literature, and literature was his life. It was the most important thing in his life. He believed in the power of literature. He believed in the power of reading, both for himself and for others. He believed, I think, that if you didn't read carefully and closely the great works of literature, that you were missing a huge part of life. that you were unlikely to become conscious. That literature was much more than a pastime for him. Much more. It was his life. And I think that's the most important part of his character that the letters reveal. If that wasn't clear already, I think it's abundantly clear by the time you finish reading these letters.
You said that and the question is to what extent the letters reveal about himself, and you said at the beginning that one of the more intriguing letters were letters he wrote to Dymphna, and then they stop, and those kind of intimate letters stop, and they come back in when he's writing to Madeleine and when he's writing to, and I can't remember his American girlfriend. And it's like it stopped, and the question then is this thing obviously that letters are not a form that which he feels comfortable, because it's almost like a fraud, that there is something in the style of letter writing that prevents for him from being authentic or saying something about himself. Could you just comment on that one?
Yeah. So there's a quote from a letter that I use as my epigraph to the whole book, which I think sums up what you're saying. It's from a letter to Michael McClaverty's biographer, a woman called Sophia Hillen, that he writes in 1991. And she's asking him, can she quote from some of his letters to McClaverty? And he says he would prefer that she didn't. And here's why. He says, I think that the difficulty of dealing with letters is that they are never quite honest. Often out of sympathy or diffidence or kindness or affection or self-interest, we quite rightly hide our true feelings. Now, then you might say to yourself, well, why bother reading the Letters of John McGahern then, if he's telling us a pack of lies? Now, the thing is, I don't believe that he's telling us a pack of lies. In fact, I was giving a class just today on this very subject about the use of letters for the study of writers. Letters are our best chance at catching a writer off guard, I think. Unguarded moments, private moments that, I mean, his American girlfriend, for instance, Mary Keelan, she decided to keep those letters. And then, 60 years later, she decides to let me see them. John McGahern couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams that they would be published and freely available. So they're unguarded, I think, sincere letters. I mean, of course, we do put on a mask for each person we meet. The letter I would write to my father would be a different letter than the one I would write to my wife or to my son or to my best friend. That's life. The conversation you will have with your friend in the pub, and I hope you get to the pub after this talk, will be different to the conversation you might have with, I don't know, the person you're buying the petrol from. Of course we change, but that doesn't mean it's insincere. So I'm giving a very rambling answer there, I think. I fully believe in the value of letters, not just these letters, but all writers and all people's letters. I think that they're a very interesting portal into the inner life. Yeah.
Okay, and I on that point, because going back to the issue of to what extent they are autobiographical, in many respects the writing, writing about yourself in terms of a novel is a way of getting at yourself in a different way. Mm-hmm. You're coming at yourself from an imaginative, and you're kind of a detached view of yourself. But it's surprising that there was an opportunity to emotionally reveal, because this is where we come back to the question about the character. That there is a sense of, we know McGahern through his memoir, which, as you said, is not really indicative, and then we know him through the fictions, which are an imaginative a version of himself. And then the letters, instead of being, if you like, a less guarded, emotional unburdening of himself, turn out to be quite guarded.
Yeah, that's fair. He was a very private man. Yeah, I would say he was a deeply private individual. And so there aren't, the letters are careful. Yeah. Can I just say, I noticed a comment that came up in chat there that I'd just like to address. Someone asked about copyright, which is an interesting question. That's correct. The comment you made is correct. The writer of the letter owns the copyright. So the writer of these letters was John McGahern. So when he died, that passed to his literary estate. They are the holders of the copyright for the letter. That's what if you remember the recent Meghan Markle case against the Daily Mail was about. It was her letter that they quoted. It was her letter to her father. Her father sold the letter to the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail quoted it. They had no right to quote it because copyright remained with Meghan Markle. So that's believe me, I've thought a good bit about this, and you have to when you're working. So, for instance, I do quote from some letters to John McGahern. So, for instance, the Charles Monteith, I quote from him fairly often, with the blessing of Faber. Sorry, Tom. Yeah.
No, does that mean that there are a lot of letters written to McGahern that have yet to be kind of made use of or sourced?
Well over 1,000.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, let's go back to there's two things that I think that come from the letters and from your editing, which is that we get a really good insight into the literary scene, and you've already kind of referred to it. But how, in the sense of that, he was dismissive. Everybody, except Yeats, obviously, and Kavanagh. But one of the things that comes across is that literary scene. And if you could just your view or your take on McGahern entering into that, for the people who haven't read it, you get this wonderful thing from the letters of this young country lad entering into this quite esoteric, quite highbrow literary scene, and then finding his way.
Well, I think it's interesting that he decided to live in Foxfield, County Leitrim, rather than in Dublin. He did not want to be part of, or he didn't want to be too close to the literary scene. The literary scene that he entered in the 50s in Dublin was centered around McDade's pub, with Patrick Kavanagh at its center. That's been very well documented. It's a very boozy, macho world. John writes about it in a story like Bank Holiday, for instance, where where Kavanagh is clearly fictionalized. John wanted to get on with his own work, and he didn't really want to be surrounded. And none of his close friends are writers. He does write to writers. He writes to Seamus Heaney, he writes to Paul Muldoon, etc. There's quite a few, but they're quite, I would say, guarded letters. Those ones to writers. His better friends were not writers, and he needed the quietness and the peace, I think, of where he lived. He didn't want to be down in McDade's talking about who's in and who's out, who's up and who's down. He didn't like that world, and he felt it was. And Monteith also advised him, don't live in Dublin, and so he didn't. So when he did eventually move back to Ireland, it was initially to Cleggan in 1970, and then onwards to Leitrim a little bit later.
Again, that for me is something that's quite interesting in the sense of that he's so rooted in Foxfield. He writes, about his life in Coothall and his life in the Amiface the Rising Sun of Foxfield, but they don't get much mention in the letters. And it's like as if that he had this life as a farmer,
Hmm.
But he sometimes refers to the local people in the area, but it's like as if he's detached from them as much as he was detached from the literary scene.
Well, I think he was. I mean, I think that I think those of you who knew him, and I'm sure some of you did, he could be quite a sociable character, and he liked fun and gossip and ribaldry. But I also think that he I think most of us need friends. I don't think John really needed friends. I don't think he needed um I think Madeline was extremely important to him, and having Madeline in Foxfield, and they had a very solid and interesting friendship and relationship. Um, but I don't think I I I I think he was someone who worked easily alone, and so you don't get much comment. There is the occasional bit about some of his neighbors and so on around the lake, but not much. You're right. I think he's someone who lives generally largely in his own mind, and that's where the action happens, and that's how we have 6 fantastic novels and 30 plus wonderful short stories, because he did live largely in his own mind.
Yes, and as we know, I get quite able to get lost in it for hours at a time.
Yeah.
Not so much in reading, but as he says later, in terms of writing. Okay, listen, we are very conscious of keeping this to an hour, so that not only you but all the other participants can get on with the other things. But again, this has been just wonderful. I mean, and it justifies our determination and our belief that this can work. But you've made a wonderful, again, as you said, keeping him alive by keeping the letters and getting more insight. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure everybody else is looking forward, and wish you well in the task of, but no better person to write the official biography of John McGahern. Frank, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all those people who put in comments and suggestions for the chat room. I hope you enjoyed it. The comments suggest that everybody has, but that's thank you to you, Frank, for a really wonderful, insightful, and enjoyable evening.
Thanks
you
very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I hope to get to the barracks
Please,
one of these days.
please do.
Okay. Good night.
Night.